The timeline of justice is rarely straight. Sometimes it bends. Sometimes it loops. And sometimes it circles back years later. On July 6, 2019, a private jet landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Federal agents were waiting on the runway. The man stepping off that aircraft was Jeffrey Edward Epstein. Financier, philanthropist, social figure. He was arrested on federal charges of sex trafficking of minors. For many, this felt like the beginning of the story. But it was not. To understand how the case reached that runway in 2019, we must return to Palm Beach, Florida. The year was 2005. Palm Beach is known for privacy. Walled estates, palm-lined streets, discretion. In March 2005, local police received a complaint from a parent. The report alleged that a teenage girl had been recruited to provide massages at a private residence on El Brillo Way. The house belonged to Jeffrey Epstein. Investigators from the Palm Beach Police Department began looking into the allegation. What they uncovered suggested something more structured than an isolated incident. According to police reports later made public, multiple teenage girls described similar experiences. They were recruited by acquaintances, transported to the estate, paid for massages that sometimes escalated into sexual contact. Several accounts described a referral system. Girls were allegedly encouraged to bring in others, receiving additional compensation for doing so. Investigators interviewed dozens of potential victims and witnesses. Search warrants were executed. Physical evidence was collected. By mid-2006, local police had assembled a case file they believed warranted serious felony charges. The matter was referred to the state attorney's office. Soon after, federal authorities became involved. And this is where the path of the case began to change. When criminal investigations escalate from local to federal jurisdiction, the stakes shift. Federal prosecutors operate under different charging standards. Grand jury proceedings are confidential. Plea negotiations often occur outside public view. In 2007 and 2008, discussions took place between Epstein's legal team and federal prosecutors in Florida. These negotiations would culminate in what became known as a non-prosecution agreement. A non-prosecution agreement is a legal contract. It allows prosecutors to decline federal charges in exchange for specific conditions being met. In Epstein's case, the agreement required him to plead guilty to 2 state-level charges: solicitation of prostitution and procurement of a person under 18 for prostitution. He would serve time in a county jail, register as a sex offender, pay restitution to identified victims. But the agreement contained another provision. It granted federal immunity from prosecution for Epstein and for unnamed potential co-conspirators. That clause would later become one of the most scrutinized elements of the case. At the time, the agreement remained largely out of public attention. Many of the victims were not informed of its terms until after it was finalized. In 2008, Epstein entered his plea. Epstein was sentenced to 18 months in the Palm Beach County Jail. He ultimately served approximately 13 months. Under the terms of his arrangement, he was permitted work release, 6 days a week, up to 12 hours per day outside the jail facility. He was transported to an office he maintained in West Palm Beach. He returned to jail at night. Work release programs are not uncommon. They're designed to allow inmates to maintain employment. But critics later argued that the privileges in this case were unusually expansive. During his incarceration, Epstein was housed in a private wing of the jail. He had access to visitors. He was not in general population. In July 2009, he was released. The federal investigation was effectively closed. In the years that followed, legal scholars and victims' advocates raised concerns about the 2008 agreement. They questioned why federal charges had been declined, why immunity extended beyond Epstein himself, why victims were not fully notified prior to finalization. In 2011, civil lawsuits were filed by several victims. These suits sought damages and challenged aspects of the plea agreement process. But in criminal court, the matter appeared resolved. For nearly a decade, Epstein resumed life in elite social and academic circles. He traveled, donated to research initiatives, maintained residences in New York, Florida, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Social photographs from that period show him attending gatherings with business leaders, academics, and public figures. Most of those individuals were never accused of criminal wrongdoing in connection to the Palm Beach case. But the perception of insulation, of wealth buffering consequence, remained.
In late 2018, the Miami Herald published an investigative series titled Perversion of Justice. The reporting re-examined the 2008 plea agreement. It highlighted internal communications between prosecutors. It featured interviews with victims who said they had been sidelined in the legal process. The series reignited national attention. Public pressure mounted. Federal authorities in New York began reviewing the case independently of the Florida agreement. The key legal question became jurisdictional. Did the Florida non-prosecution agreement bind federal prosecutors in New York? The answer would determine whether the case could be reopened. In July 2019, a federal grand jury in the Southern District of New York returned an indictment. The charges focused on alleged conduct occurring in New York between 2002 and 2005. This geographic distinction was significant. It allowed prosecutors to argue that the Florida agreement did not preclude charges in New York. The indictment alleged a broader trafficking enterprise. It referenced multiple victims. When Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport, it marked the first time he faced federal trafficking charges. At his bail hearing, prosecutors argued he posed a serious flight risk. They cited his substantial financial resources, his international connections, his access to private aircraft. The judge denied bail. Epstein was remanded to federal custody in Manhattan. The reopening of the case triggered broader public reflection. How had the 2008 agreement come to pass? What factors influence prosecutorial discretion? How does wealth intersect with negotiation leverage? Former prosecutors noted that plea agreements are common in complex cases. They conserve resources, avoid uncertain jury outcomes. But others argued that transparency matters most in cases involving vulnerable victims and powerful defendants. In February 2019, months before Epstein's death, a federal judge ruled that prosecutors in Florida had violated the Crime Victims' Rights Act by failing to adequately inform victims about the non-prosecution agreement. That ruling did not undo the agreement, but it validated concerns about process. Long before 2019, the Epstein case had become about more than a single defendant. It raised enduring questions. How does influence shape legal outcomes? What mechanisms ensure accountability? When agreements are sealed, who reviews them? The American justice system relies heavily on prosecutorial discretion. Most criminal cases never go to trial. They resolve through negotiation. In high-profile cases, that discretion becomes visible, and visibility invites scrutiny. The Palm Beach Agreement would later be studied in law schools as an example of controversial plea bargaining. It became a case study in transparency, in victim notification rights, in federal versus state jurisdiction boundaries. By mid-2019, the case that had once seemed closed was active again. New charges, new victims, new federal oversight. For many observers, it appeared that a decade of dormancy had ended. The system was correcting itself. But this time, the outcome would not be decided in a courtroom.
Because before trial could begin, before witnesses could testify, before cross-examinations could unfold, the case would take a turn no one could fully anticipate. In 2008, a plea agreement reshaped the trajectory of the Epstein case. It limited federal prosecution. It shielded unnamed individuals from potential charges. It allowed a defendant to serve a sentence many critics viewed as unusually lenient. For 10 years, the file appeared dormant. Then it reopened. The next chapter would unfold not in a courtroom, but inside a federal detention facility in Manhattan. And the questions surrounding what happened there would eclipse everything that came before it. This has been part 1. In the next episode of the Cold Files, detention, death in custody, and the institutional failures that followed,